Hoi, leuk dat je kijkt. Mijn naam is Brakel en ik sta op plek 26 van de kandidatenlijst voor GroenLinks. Vanavond ga ik in gesprek met Chlöe Swarbrick. Zij is een hele grote inspiratiebron van mij persoonlijk. Ze is net als ik een beetje een nerd, althans zo beschrijft ze zichzelf. En ze stelde zich in 2016 kandidaat voor de burgemeestersverkiezingen van de stad Auckland in Nieuw-Zeeland, omdat ze politici oninspirerend vond. En daarom zette ze die stap. Die verloor ze, die verkiezingen net. Maar een jaar later werd ze parlementariër voor de Groenen in Nieuw-Zeeland en slaagde ze erin om de klimaatnoodtoestand in Nieuw-Zeeland uit te roepen. Daar ga ik het nu met haar over hebben. In Nederland hebben we die klimaatnoodtoestand nog niet. Wel in Utrecht, in Amsterdam en in Haarlem, maar nog niet in Nederland, in het hele land. En van haar wil ik weten hoe we dat, welke lessen we kunnen leren van Nieuw-Zeeland en hoe we dat ook in Nederland kunnen regelen. Ik ga er nu even proberen toe te voegen. Even kijken of dat gaat.
Is that work?
Chloe. It did.
Kia ora. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. We've just come out actually in Auckland in Tamaki Makaurau in New Zealand out of alert level. We have an alert level system, so alert level 3, where we've been in lockdown here in Auckland because we had a small, wouldn't say outbreak because we haven't yet managed to trace the source, but I've been in lockdown and now I'm out of lockdown, so I'm fantastic, my friend. How are you?
Excellent. I very briefly described your CV in Dutch. We are still down. Our evening curfew has just started, or starting in about 28 minutes, and then we'll all have to be inside. What I wanted to ask you, because we got many questions from this, what is life like outside of a lockdown?
Well, I think that's kind of a similar question to what life is like when you are who you are and you don't know what other people are necessarily going through. I mean, I'm really fortunate to have friends who live in other jurisdictions. So I'm regularly in touch with, for example, my mate Jana, who lives in London. She's a midwife. And just listening to the experiences over there of people kind of in a constant feedback loop of in and out of lockdown, or slightly kind of technical changes around the edges of what you are and aren't allowed to do. But yeah, for us, I think that freedom is pretty damn special, and the ability to congregate. Like we had all of the election campaign last year was dogged by COVID-19, and kind of trying to organise a community around what is typically physical presence, things like marching, things like hui or meeting, to try and do that online is pretty difficult. So yeah, we're very lucky, and I think we're all really stoked to be in the position that we are, which I guess, you know, obviously comes with planning, but also the good fortune of being a small island at the bottom of the world.
We are super, super jealous as a small country, not detached from the rest of the world. We have 27 minutes-ish to discuss, obviously, your campaign to declare a climate emergency and what the Netherlands can learn from that. And I was wondering if you could go back to the beginning of the climate emergency in New Zealand. I did a bit of research and saw that Melbourne, I think, or a part of Melbourne in 2016 was the first place in the world to have declared a climate emergency. But how did that campaign start in New Zealand, and what was your role?
So the campaign in Aotearoa, New Zealand, came actually primarily from the grassroots, as these kinds of things often do. And the kōrero or conversation on the ground was entirely about kind of, we need to effectively demarcate where we sit in relation to the rest of the world. And there were calls obviously from the likes of Greta Thunberg as well. School Strike for Climate was picking up a huge amount of steam here. And there also was some awesome activists who built kind of amazing communities directly around them. So there was an amazing guy called Ollie who kind of sat on Parliament lawn for 100 days calling for a climate emergency every single day. And all of these things were an attempt to build that mandate. And every time I was in Wellington, because that's where our parliament is, our capital, which is quite a distance from Auckland, where I live, I would go out and kind of talk to him and try and figure out how we could actually take what he was doing outside of parliament in. And one of the many ways that we tried to do that over that 100 days, which doesn't sound like much in the scheme of a parliamentary term, but is a huge amount of time when you are sitting there, you know, hail and rain and wind lashing at you. I took in his sign into the chamber, and we basically just tried every which way. I was sitting at that point in time on something called the Environment Select Committee. Select committees are smaller proportional kind of parliamentarian groupings which take apart legislation and are supposed to hear more from the public, those kinds of things. I attempted to negotiate across the parliamentary aisle because unless something is a government motion, you cannot get it through unless it has the agreement of every single political party in Parliament. Our right-wing party, the National Party, was not particularly keen on what they tried to characterise as virtue signalling. Virtue signalling, by definition, is kind of a symbolic move which ostensibly does something but actually doesn't. The very reason that I was really bound up in supporting the call for a climate emergency is because, as far as I could tell, that declaration that this is us recognising the science and that we will be bound by it sets a yardstick and a point to which the government and future governments can be held accountable. So we worked to try and make more kind of stronger backing to that, but we effectively didn't manage to get it done in that term of Parliament. But as soon as we came back, into the next iteration of Parliament after the election, there was a succession of a lot of things actually which myself and other Green MPs have been working on for a while. We, for example, legalised drug checking services, which is another campaign that I've been working on for ages, and we declared the climate emergency straight off the back. So it was almost as though there was all of this pressure and there was all of this campaigning, and some people felt as though hope had been lost or whatever else, but then there was the straw that broke the camel's back. And that was finally getting into government and the government needing to show that it could do something in its first kind of 100 days. So yeah, that was how it all kind of came about.
Well, looking at it from the Netherlands, where none of this is happening, this is obviously hugely inspiring to me, and I think to many Green Party members here as well, as we're hoping to push for that. Now you have this climate emergency, you have the declaration. If you compare before and after, were the National Party right? Was it usually symbolic and not much else, or did more happen?
Well, it did force a debate in Parliament about what this actually meant. And I mean, in that debate, and this is the very thing about Parliament as an institution, I think that a lot of people fathom Parliament or the political system or government to be this big thing over there which interacts with our lives in hugely negative ways. It's normally caricatured as. But we don't often think of Parliament or government as a very literal manifestation of the will of the people, which is what it should be. So that debate, which was forced by the triggering of the declaration of climate emergency, was incredibly fruitful in that it put a spotlight on the views and the ideologies held by parliamentarians. And there was a lot of flack, a lot of, I'm not sure if that transcends, there was a lot of critique of the way that the National Party spokesperson on climate change held themselves out during that debate, effectively trying to deny that there was any need to act urgently. And the classic refrain that we hear, and this surrounds the debate that we've had over the past 3 years as we've had a Green Climate Change Minister, James Shaw, who's the co-leader of the party, around the Zero Carbon Act, which is effectively a copy of the Climate Change Act 2008 from the UK, which puts in place an independent climate change commission, which, we start setting carbon budgets and then the government is responsible to progressing that on a reverse engineered basis from the year 2050. And then there's also the emissions trading scheme. Constantly, we heard that New Zealand's too small to ever make a difference. But my point constantly was actually, I'm really stoked to hear you echo the sentiments, that what we do here matters because it shows civil society and parliamentarians around the rest of the world exactly what is possible. And when all of those little people band together and force their governments to do the right thing, then hey presto, you've got massive global action, which is resulting in substantive change. So we kind of set a precedent, and in turn it enables others to push forward. But I'm also really cautious of how New Zealand can often end up being framed, particularly in international media, as kind of a liberal utopia, because it's not. And we have a lot of issues here. So I also want to be really cautious in, you know, perpetuating that mythology, because whilst we do some good things, we also still have a lot to do, particularly when it comes to poverty and climate action, and in climate action, particularly around the just transition, because there are a number of people right now whose jobs are invested in, for example, our highest kind of part of the emissions profile in agriculture and in oil and gas fields. So those workers have to be considered, as opposed to just the big companies, which is the way it's been framed in public dialogue so far.
Yeah, because I gave a lot of people a chance to write in questions beforehand, and many people were asking about the just transition and sort of the fears that are alive here, that a climate transition will just benefit the people that have the Tesla car and live the good life, and everyone else will suffer. Like, how does that debate work in New Zealand, and what did the Greens try and do to sort of mitigate that?
Yeah, so I mean, in all seriousness, the dialogue around kind of social justice issues in Aotearoa in New Zealand has been quite challenging for at least my lifetime, and I'm aware that I'm 26 years old. So, you know, the massive kind of economic changes that the rest of the world saw, that are often kind of characterised as neoliberal, that is kind of the stripping of the state's involvement in supporting people, social safety net and otherwise, occurred in 1984. In this country, and we actually were kind of the test lab for a lot of those changes to the way that the world now functions, with a greater reliance on market systems and all the rest. But actually, as we've seen in a number of examples, perhaps most recently the GameStop, the kind of stock market situation, the system that, you know, people are quite happy to say that we should rely on the market until the market is able to be manipulated to work for the average person. And so we see when it comes to conversations around things like tax in this country. So New Zealand's been dogged by quite substantive inequality for decades now. And we have the highest rates of inequality in generations. And that's the real intersection with the climate justice movement, of course. We also obviously have a framework for what should be the basis of interaction with Indigenous peoples, that is Te Tiriti o Waitangi with tanga whenua Māori, iwi Māori. And there hasn't been all too much, if any, meaningful honouring of that treaty in the past 160 odd years. So that's been a real fight as well. And there's increasing recognition internationally in the scientific fields of how Mataranga Māori, or Indigenous knowledge, is incredibly important to our development moving forward, in the way that we see our natural habitat and our oceans and the kind of ecosystem and life cycles and otherwise. So when it comes to the just transition, that was originally fathomed by NGOs, non-governmental organisations, by Indigenous groups and otherwise, as actually an opportunity to redistribute resources and to organise the economy according to how human beings can live within our means and the life's earth-giving capacity, Earth's life-giving capacity. And what that's ended up becoming through this kind of constant political noise and nonsense, but also all of this bureaucracy inside of departments and ministries and kind of governmental bureaucracies, it's been greenwashed, basically. And it's come to mean for some people that we have everything that we have right now. We have the inequality, but we just make it green. So there isn't, I don't think, a mainstream understanding of what the just transition is or should look like. And in particularly New Zealand, I don't think that we are tackling that conversation where it needs to be tackled, around particularly taxation. And that is perhaps because it's become such a political hot potato for so long. But otherwise, you know, as I'm sure, and as I know you know, Mark, the big problem with regard to kind of climate change and global warming is that the effects of it are going to be felt first and worst by those who are the least well off, and often actually happen to also be the people who've contributed the least in terms of climate changing emissions. Whereas those who have the most resources are typically those who've contributed the most in terms of climate changing emissions, but they also happen to have the resources to buy themselves real estate further up the proverbial hill, away from sea level rises and those kinds of things. And that, yeah, is where kind of the intersection of the debate really comes down to. But yeah, the appetite for a discussion around economic redistribution and a more equitable society is still at the tinkering around the edges stage here, unfortunately. So we keep fighting.
final question on New Zealand before we sort of move to the Netherlands, but you are where we want to be. You're in government, whereas the Dutch Greens are fighting tooth and nail to get there at this election in a month's time. Do you feel your government ministers are at least sort of moving that just transition discussion forward? Are they doing enough to change that debate, or is it something that you have to push from Parliament?
Yeah, so they are doing a huge amount with the power afforded to them. So in the 2017-2020 parliamentary term, because we have 3-year parliamentary terms, we had 3 different government ministers and 1 undersecretary, which in a parliament of 120 with only 8 Green members of parliament is a pretty disproportionate influence. On top of that, because of all of that work that we were constantly trying to do and facilitate with those who are on the ground, who are building the mandate for this change, we, I think, again, managed to push kind of further and faster to the places that we wanted the government to be. But with all of that said, we were still only 8 out of 120 members of parliament. So whilst we managed to get a disproportionate influence in a lot of the good things, when certain things, particularly in a 3-party coalition government in the last term, with a far more conservative rump of another political party who now no longer is in parliament, there were a number of things that we weren't able to achieve because of conversations that happened behind the scenes. And on that point, I would say that, you know, all of this comes down to what the theory of change is for the Greens in the Netherlands. And that's about making sure that you connect to and stay connected to those who are on the outside. I said in my maiden speech, and I reflect on it every so often, because Parliament is a reality distortion field. You know, you can go in there and think that you are mad because people don't think that poverty exists, and you've just walked past on the entryway people who are sleeping rough on the streets. And the only way that you're able to retain that sense of anchor is to stay connected to the grassroots. And the grassroots will be angry when you're not able to achieve the things that you want to achieve. But that is not a reason to turn away from those activists and advocates. In fact, it's a reason to continue to stay connected and to try and build that mandate outside of Parliament. So the challenge is always going to be that one of transparency and how you continue to communicate, because otherwise we become institutionalized like the rest of the parliamentary parties, as opposed to kind of the parliamentary wing of a grassroots green activist movement for change, for economic and climate and Indigenous justice. So yeah, it doesn't come without its challenges, but it definitely is beneficial, because I think most New Zealanders can now see the potent power that we can have as disproportionate influence for the better.
Yeah, no, I'm obviously definitely hoping that we can get there as well and sort of, bring that grassroots power into the Dutch parliament, even though it's now even harder given that we are not allowed to knock on doors. Everyone's locked inside, but we have digital tools, thankfully. If we move to the Netherlands, which I personally find hugely frustrating, as you may know, a quarter of the country is below sea level. And although we have a lot of resources, we do stand to lose quite heavily from the effects of climate change, as does the whole world. And even though we project an image to the outside world of the first country to legalize gay marriage and the first country to sort of condone marijuana use, I think a lot of that happened in the 90s, and we're slowing down more and more. I mean, if you look at the European Union, after Malta and Luxembourg, we are the 3rd worst country in producing sustainable energy. So there's a lot of work that's left for us to do. If you would give advice to the Dutch Green Party as a consultant, what would you tell us? Where do we go to get this climate emergency declared?
Yeah, so I mean, that's the thing. I cannot presume as an outsider to know next to anything about the shape of your democracy and the will of the people. But as with all kind of grassroots movements and broad-based grassroots movements, my general approach is to recognize that, you know, there's 2 ways that you can bring about change in politics, from my understanding. There's kind of structural, and the structural sphere, and that's legislation, regulation, funding, taxation, incentives, subsidies, etc. That's supposed to be the bread and butter of central and local governments to build a blueprint for change. But the stuff that we don't often talk about is culture, and culture is the unsaid stuff. It is actually the environment that is conducive to or creates structural change. So culture, by a design thinking definition, is a shared set of values. Often we get caught up in thinking that culture is cultural practices. So things like religious practices, or, you know, people from different ethnic backgrounds practicing certain ways of doing things. That is a manifestation of culture, but culture by definition is a shared set of values, which is how you can have shared culture across different geographical, ethnic, religious, kind of life experience, how you can transcend all of those things. So the way that culture is built is through community building, it's through education, it's through media, including social media, it's through things like petition and protest and collective action. So I would focus on that, on what is the culture, what is the shared values, because oftentimes we think that people sit in opposition to us and we feel very comfortable sitting in our bubble, and everyone's all agreeing with each other, and that's very nice and comfortable. And then we blame the outside for not necessarily agreeing with us without ever even seeking to actively go and talk to them. So, for example, when it comes to things like the just transition, one of the things that's frustrated me, and you know, I absolutely now, particularly with the privilege of my role, have an opportunity to play a part in trying to change this. But I've constantly been frustrated with the way that government and ministries and departments have preferred to consult with the giants of the kind of like the people who are the top of the hierarchy in the farming industry, agriculture being, you know, the 50-odd% of our emissions profile. They prefer to consult with the CEOs of the oil companies as opposed to the workers. Those workers value, of course, their skills, but on top of that, they want to, you know, make a good day's pay for a good day's work and provide for their family. If you were to meaningfully engage with those people who, you know, as a result of reforms in the 1980s, don't tend to be collectivized or unionized or otherwise, but if you find a way to connect directly with those people and build that mandate from those who are otherwise silenced, then you completely circumvent and subvert the way that, you know, there's typically just a top dog to top dog conversation, and instead you build a movement of people power. So without knowing all too much about the situation in the Netherlands, I would think that that's probably the best way to go about it, because everybody is connected to a broader network. And when you find people who are willing to, you know, be the canary in the coal mine, to speak out differently from the kind of party line or the kind of common sense or whatever you want to call it of their industry, find that person, communicate with that person, and build, you know, the resistance inside those industries and those institutions, because those people exist and, you know, they want to be proud of the work that they do. But the people who are at the top are very comfortable remaining at the top, and they'll do everything they can to keep that house of cards as cemented as possible.
Yeah, no, I think that's very helpful advice to try and sort of move beyond the regular groups and sort of reach out to build a broader coalition to try and break the way things are usually done. You mentioned agriculture. Someone also sent in a question saying that that's the obvious parallel between New Zealand and the Netherlands. We are the second biggest exporter of fruits and vegetables in the world, which is crazy because it's all gas heated. The tomatoes that we send over to Britain, for example. A lot, like the Netherlands is starting to tackle emissions from industry, from transport, but nothing is being done on agriculture. Sort of what is New Zealand doing in agriculture to reduce emissions, and is there anything we can learn from that?
So it's fascinating because, so as I said before, 48% of our emissions profile in this country comes from farming, from agriculture. And there's been, it's almost been the sacred cow of the conversation around the economy for a really long time now. And this was also the case when we were dealing with massive issues with the quality of our waterways, because of obviously the proximity on, you know, farmland to our waterways and our water systems, and the kind of runoff and otherwise. So the way that we deal with that is actually by bringing everybody into the tent. And this causes a huge amount of disconcern, understandably. And this is just one theory of change, so I want to be really upfront about that. But what James Shaw, who is our climate minister, Green Party MP and co-leader, did was he forced all of the people around the table who are currently engaged in the industry and said, this is your problem. This is the country's problem, but also this is your problem. And you know that this is coming. You know that sooner rather than later, we are going to have to force down to bend that curve of emissions profiles rising. And we can put a kind of price on you. We can do a bunch of other things, but basically you need to be in this room to figure out how you are going to tackle this, because, you know, we can do it to you and we can do that, or you can be part of this conversation, but you're not getting out of this room until we've sorted it out. And what we ended up doing, and it therefore was actually very difficult for the opposition National Party to critique, is setting up the world's first emissions profile pricing on agriculture, which will come into effect in the next few years. So agriculture will be folded into what we call the emissions trading scheme if they do not come up with an alternative pricing mechanism in the next 3, I believe, years. So that's how we did it. And whilst, you know, that isn't an immediate change, it is effectively it's going to happen, and it has to happen, and it's in legislation, and again, everybody has basically signed up to it at this point. So it's that way of doing things, but again, it's also about realizing that where we had to start in Aotearoa in New Zealand was at a far more difficult place than other jurisdictions. So I mentioned before the UK and their Climate Change 2008 Act. And they had almost the privilege of starting at the easy stuff, at the low-hanging fruit of trying to figure out how to decarbonize their energy. New Zealand is already almost 100% renewable. We're in the 90s, and it's very easy to get to that point from now. And, you know, we have hit most of the efficiencies there. So we have to do the hard stuff, the food production first. So grappling with the reality of that and sitting in how difficult that is, and constant communication was the only way to tackle it. And yeah, I'm really proud of the work that we've done there, but of course it has to go further, it has to go faster, and there were other things that we would have done had we not been operating inside of the parliamentary system that we were, and we had 61 instead of 8 votes. But nonetheless, again, building that public mandate was the way to get it done.
Yeah, we're also hugely jealous of the Climate Change Commission in the UK, and I wish we had one. Final question, because I know you also have other things to do and have to run off eventually after this. A lot of people wrote questions about nuclear energy, because our right-wing parties have started to say we've fallen so far behind our targets. The state has even been judged to sort of have fallen behind its targets in a lawsuit pressed by an NGO as the first state to have been ordered by a court to up its game on reducing climate emissions. What is your response to those right-wing parties arguing that nuclear is the way to go to sort of make good on time lost?
So, I mean, the first thing would be to say that I think a lot of people like to think that there's silver bullets when it comes to climate action. And in thinking that way about climate action, a lot of people manage to live in this fairy tale about how our world can remain relatively the same as it is, but just be green, and we can just remove certain emissions and put them in this, you know, rubbish bin of never never, and it all just disappears, and we can continue with the current rampant inequality that we've got, but we are not having the same amount of impact on the planet. And I'm sorry, but the reality is scientist after scientist after scientist after expert after scientist can tell you that that's just simply untrue. You know, if you look at this through an economic lens, and actually to really tackle the economic question, often those right-wingers will invoke the idea of the economy as though it's this god or this deity that everybody has to sacrifice to when it's angry, as opposed to realizing that the economy isn't something external. The economy is us. It very literally is the manifestation of all of the people in it and the things that we create. But this disproportionate focus on GDP, which was created in the 1980s by this guy called, I've forgotten his name off the top of my head, but the kind of process of that creation in the 1930s, Simon Kuznets is his name, was this is a way that you can count all of the production in the country, but God forbid, do not use it as a measure of the welfare or the well-being of people, because it doesn't measure the quality of the production, it doesn't measure the distribution of all of those things that are produced. So constantly chasing how we can continue to do things the way that we have been and just zap it with some nuclear energy is the worst way to go about tackling this issue of a just transition to begin with. But on top of that, nuclear energy, of course, comes with massive amounts of risk. You know, in Aotearoa in New Zealand, I'm not sure if you're familiar, but we, you know, were the ones who stood up against the United States and the French around nuclear power and around nuclear ships and otherwise. And we had a very tense international relationship as a result of that for the following few decades. But that's the real importance of international independent foreign policy. But locally, just you have to look at the immense amounts of risk that nuclear energy can pose. And if you can provide energy without needing to resort to quite dangerous alternatives, why would you opt for those other than just intending to try and keep the currently rich and, you know, the current state of inequality as it is? So yeah, invest in renewables. It's far more sensible, and it means that you don't have to deal with the toxic and incredibly dangerous issue of nuclear waste.
Yeah, no, I really hope that we can remove this distraction from the Dutch political debate and sort of, make that point that there is no silver bullet and that we need to transition, launch a sort of wide transition that includes every part of society and not just focus on this one tokenist issue. I'm loving the international solidarity, and thank you so much for joining this conversation from the other end of the world in your evening here. I really hope that in a year's time I can report back and say that we have managed to declare a climate emergency in the Netherlands, closed our coal plants, introduced a carbon tax, and cut the 8 billion a year in fossil fuel subsidies that we now provide and continue to provide. Fingers crossed to that.
Yeah. And this is the importance of that international solidarity, my friend. With these green movements at a local and central government and international level, we can change the world. And when it comes to people saying, oh, well, we're just a tiny country that emits, you know, 0.2%. If all of those tiny countries banded together, would be, I believe, a quarter of the world's global emissions. So yes, absolutely, Kapai, and all power to you, my friend. I hope all goes well with the election to come.